we just witnessed the tech takeover of the government, right? Or some people might say the government takeover of tech, which I think is probably the long-term story, but I kind of tried to think about it in historical context. And I guess in my view, this has been the way it's always been. And so whoever's running the hot, dynamic, growing industry, they end up shaping our politics and culture.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey there. Welcome to The New Rules with Alan Pentz, where we help you navigate today's chaos with precision. Your host, Alan Pentz, has 25 years of experience working in business and government, and he knows how the old rules have fallen apart. Each episode, we'll explore how to thrive in this new landscape by mastering the new rules while everyone else is still figuring them out. Let's dive in.
Next week, we'll talk about the main exports and average GDP of each person in Yale. But this week, what are we going to talk about?
This week, well, it's been a few weeks, so we've got a couple of things to talk about. First, last week, I think you wrote about the tech takeover. Well, there's two things. The tech takeover, right? I wanted to start with that because I was just thinking, in the spirit of the inauguration, tech takeover, all the baldies in the room yesterday. I think, let's start there, Alan.
I like the Saturday Night Live, actually, the one, not Baldy, is Zuckerberg being there. And I think it was Michael Che's joke on Saturday Night Live News. It was like, Mark Zuckerberg, seen here looking like a Puerto Rican gigolo is... Yeah, so I think I wrote this about how, I guess at the high level, it's like we've just witnessed the tech takeover of the government, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or some people might say the government takeover of tech, which I think is probably the long-term story, but I kind of tried to think about it in historical context. Mm-hmm. And I guess in my view, this has kind of been the way it's always been. And so, whoever's running, there's a famous quote from President Calvin Coolidge that the business of America is business. Mm-hmm. And I think throughout our history, whatever industry is sort of like the hot, dynamic, growing industry, they end up shaping our politics and culture.
Right. Well, it's like GM, it was cars,
Right. So classically,
generations ago.
And what I didn't know is that quote comes from a GM CEO who was doing a Senate hearing to become Eisenhower's defense secretary.
Mm-hmm.
So, obviously former CEO of the car company that makes a bunch of weapons and tanks is now becoming the defense secretary. And I didn't realize that that's where the quote derived from. And the quote is, what's good for GM is good for America.
Yeah.
And so I think that was I think you could hear Elon say that today about SpaceX, right?
Mm.
And obviously he wasn't the only defense secretary that was former CEO of GM. Our lovely Robert McNamara, who architected our war in Vietnam, was also a former GM CEO. And my take would be that most of the government was structured around not just GM. I mean, it was sort of like post-World War II is the ascendancy of American manufacturing, right? So large conglomerates that are steel, cars, everything that we have, refrigerators, Westinghouse and blah, 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 Whirlpool and everybody like that. So I think our government really coming out of World War II was structured along the lines of a manufacturing conglomerate. And you can kind of still see some of that in the system today. And so my take is sort of that the business of that day shapes the government. Second is that the people running those businesses are almost always, they're going to be the most dynamic, interesting, richest people because they go to those industries, right? Go West, young man is sort of the call now to go to Silicon Valley and make a ton of money, right? So the most ambitious people are attracted to that, right? And, look, Jeff Bezos started out as a hedge fund manager at D.E. Shaw after graduating from, I think he went to Princeton, right? Something like that.
Never.
Yeah. And then he saw the internet and he's like, this is where the money is, and moved back to Seattle and started Amazon, right? So I think we saw this transition from finance kind of being the primary industry in the United States, the ascendant industry. So you went from GM to like probably like energy or something like that, then to finance in the 80s and 90s. And I show in the piece, the market capitalization, the top 10 companies by market capitalization, and they're like 2005, 20 years ago, it wasn't quite as dominated by finance then as it is by tech today, but it was, 4 or 5 of the top 10 were financing companies, were banks or GE, which had basically turned into a financing company, great financial crisis. So it was really at that point that finance was the most dynamic. Everybody went to Wall Street. And then you had, Goldman Sachs running the Treasury Department for the last 20 years, 30 years.
And of the 10, so you listed 10, what is it, 7 are tech or was it 8? 7 out of...
Yeah, so now if you look at 20, I think it was 24 that I pulled it from Investopedia, there's 7 out of the 10 are now tech companies, so the top 10 largest companies in the world.
Right. So that says a lot about what we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
So that complete whereas back in 2005, there was 1 or 2, maybe Intel was still in there. Yeah. So 2 companies that were tech companies in 2005. That's now like more than tripled to 7. And only 1 company is the same, Microsoft, right? So I think it's just showing you what's the most dynamic industry. That dynamic industry then has the most dynamic, richest people. Those people then fund, shape, and run the government. And I think that's inevitable. And I don't, there's bad things about it. There's good things about it. But they not only just donate, they also start shaping policy. And then if you look at say Doge or things like that, I mean, everybody in business, everybody in any large organization, when you say, how should we manage this enterprise, this organization? What you're looking to now, you're not reading Jack Welch's biography, former CEO of GE. You're not reading whatever else in the past. You're reading about Bezos, Elon. You're reading 0 to 1, Peter Thiel. You're reading Lean Startup. You're reading, out of what that probably there was like that series of books back in the 2010s that haven't really been replaced since then. And so
Jobs
biography, right? Elon's probably the newest one.
Yeah.
So basically what my thesis is that these industries come to dominate the economy and culture and then politics, not only by giving campaign contributions, but by shaping policy. I mean, look, David Sachs, one of the early people in PayPal, founded Yammer, big venture capitalist, now is the AI crypto czar in the White House as of yesterday. So they will...
That's a big position, right?
Yeah. It's a made-up position. But I love that czar is now you used to actually run something, and now you don't do anything. Now you have no power. Yeah. So it's the more your title has to indicate that you have a lot of power, the less power you have.
That is true.
It's also anything that has the word, any field of study that has the word science in it is in the science, right? So it's physics doesn't have the word science in it, right? Environmental science has the word science in it. Right? So anyway, so that was sort of my take is what we're seeing is that, and then I kind of go on to say, there's a couple of things that come with that though, right? Is you capture the government in a way as an industry, but then the government captures you, right? And tech's just another in the long line of businesses that have gotten in there. They're going to feather the nest, right? Like GM taking over the government in the 50s, they built the national highway system. They created modern suburbs and all this kind of stuff, right? And so that was hugely beneficial to the car industry. But eventually, it's not, some of it's just aging of a industry and companies. But part of it is hey, they got a bunch of lucrative contracts from the Defense Department. They got used to getting what they wanted in Washington. And eventually they kind of come to depend on that, or most of their money is coming from these ways. So then they don't see the Japanese threat. They also create enemies within the government that maybe will form in the other party to push against them. And then, now, so it's sort of my take is you live by the sword of government, you die by the sword of government. But on the other hand, I don't think there's any way to avoid it because the government's...
I see it as a positive thing in the end. There's not...
I see it as...
nothing you about it. So let's look at...
It's inevitable.
It's inevitable. So in what way does it help and add to the whole equation, right? You said the tech government synthesis will be profitable and good for the country, right?
Right.
Right. So that's overall. But what do you say to all the people that are like, I don't know, all these guys in the room paid $1 million to the campaign and they get to sit in there? I mean, my God, even DeSantis had to sit out in the overflow room.
I know. Well, I thought that was the most telling thing of all, right? So I've heard multiple takes, right? I don't know. But I don't know, his first inaugural, it felt like there were a bunch of regular people. He was really focusing on that. Now it's like the glitzy tech billionaires and he wants us to be the golden age. And so I don't know, are they throwing MAGA out the back door? Who knows? I think that's going to be a challenge going forward, is this tech bro versus MAGA thing. I think the tech bros are going to probably win most of the fights. I mean, they have the money, the intelligence.
They have the money, yeah.
Yeah, they have the power, so, and to me, it's inevitable in the sense that if you are making the most money and you are in all the press stories, politics is coming for you one way or the other. As I said the Pericles line, just because you're not interested in politics doesn't mean politics isn't interested in you, right?
Yeah.
And he said that 2,500 years ago. So I think probably that's a truism. So in my view, that just makes all of this inevitable. It has to become part of government. There's no way to resist it. And so, yes, there's going to be a really good part of that. Hey, I love the national highway system, right? The GM, got built being part of the government. Maybe that's a little strong. That was sort of what was, that was a zeitgeist. That's what needed to happen at that time. And GM executives happened to go into government and, blah, blah, blah. But that's what we're seeing with AI right now. And it is the major thing. And so the people who do AI are shaping the government and its policy. And we're going to get a lot of benefits out of that. And this is what I would say in contrast with the Democrats, the Biden administration. I mean, I quoted Biden's farewell address.
Yeah.
And it was just the most tired, warmed over I've heard from that. Right. And the Democrats have got to get with the program. And I think they've got plenty of people who, they've got Mark Cuban. Jeff Bezos is a Democrat. Right? Who knows what he is now? I don't know. But they got Reid Hoffman, right?
Where?
Also PayPal guy, founded LinkedIn.
Yeah.
It's a better social network than Yammer. And 10 minutes ago, these guys were all Democrats. So I don't think they're all of a sudden all except for David Sachs and Peter Thiel are really Republicans. And, so I think the Dems have got to get with the program and realize that complaining about misinformation just isn't going to get you anywhere anymore. No one's listening to that. And you've got to embrace your tech bros and bring them in to help shape how you do politics, what your policies are, what are you going to do on AI? You have to have a positive message. Now, look, certainly they're, I guess you'd say the Democrats in the face of GM, they sided with the unions, right? So they sided with the other side and that won them something. But I don't know. I think you have to make peace with the dominant industry and you can't blame it for everything. And you have to find
You'll be very naive.
Right. I mean, I think that just denying them and saying we're going to regulate you can't be the response. You got to have a much more positive message about how you're working with the industry. And look, I think there's going to be a lot of problems with what comes, right? The crypto thing, it's going to be a bunch of scams and people are going to get pissed off, right? I mean, it's clearly just a way to avoid securities regulation. It's ridiculous. And it's just memes and fraud, right? So I think that's going to blow up in their face eventually. And then, people are going to get, there's going to be a lot of fights with MAGA and the tech bros, right? And maybe the tech bros don't win all of those, right? So, the MAGA and everything, they're anti-immigration. That's not, tech can't live with that long term.
I was going to say that's not really compatible with long-term tech, is it?
Right. Well, I mean, look how many of the people, not just on that stage, but around or in the audience, but all over that place are immigrants, right? I mean, most prominently there, Satya Nadella and Elon Musk, right? Both born in different countries. So I think there's just a lot of inherent conflicts within the Trump coalition that lots of people have pointed out. And so there'll be opportunities for the Democrats, right, to peel off people and make their case. But I don't think their case can be, we're going to put tech back in its box. If they do that, I think the whole tech industry is going to swing behind them. And that's, that's not going to work. You can't, even in the 50s and 60s, Democrats weren't like anti-GM. They were trying to find a synthesis that benefited labor and the company, right? And that worked for some period of time before it didn't. So I think it's really key that we don't hear lines like we did from Joe Biden saying, there's an avalanche of misinformation and disinformation enabling the abuse of power. I mean, I could name 50,000 things that administration did to put out misinformation and abuse its power. So come on, give me a break here, bud. And the truth is smothered by lies told for profit and for power. Okay, so that's the first time that's ever happened in history. I mean, come on.
That's
this
never
is
happened.
silly. This is silly stuff. And it's if you don't get off this, people just tune you out. And I think, look, Biden's old. He's leaving. So it's time for a new group of people to come in and change that timing.
And I do agree that the speech, I didn't hear the whole thing, but it on paper is quite hackneyed.
Yeah, I would say so. I think he's delusional.
Recycled terms
warmed over, Yeah, it felt like, could you make a worse contrast with Trump coming in, right? And, I think, again, I don't want to go too strong here. I think that tech, the Democrats still have huge equities within tech, and tech still is largely Democratic-leaning group of people. So there's a lot to build there, and they got to go do it. But I would look back at history, and from farming to railroads to, cars to computers to now AI, and this is the industry. Whatever that industry is going to shape how things go.
Whether you like it or not, so don't freak out. This is
just work with it.
The way it goes, and so it goes.
Right, and all these crazy, I was thinking the other day, is all these people rail, all these tech bros are railing on bureaucrats, and it's oh, by the way, basically, if you're a Doge, you're a bureaucrat now, right? So you got to start thinking, and maybe not technically, it's still not clear. Some people think they might end up becoming special government employees. Maybe they won't be at all. But the reality is you're kind of a bureaucrat now. And so now you're part of the system, right? So it will come and take you too, right? You'll get some stuff done. Maybe you can get some good done. But the system is bigger than the industries, all of us. It just incorporates it. That's the whole beauty of the system, right? It takes all these new forces and channels them through a system. And you're not gonna fundamentally re-architect the system. You're gonna make some changes. That'll be great. But the only thing bigger than tech is the US government. So it will change you just as much as you change it. So that was my sort of take on it.
Yeah. I think there's a lot to...
And if you don't agree with me, you can go look at the antitrust policy in the early 1900s. That's a period where I would say even more, the industrialists had even more power than they do today. I would say substantially more. And I think people like Roosevelt came in and said, let's see who has more power, and basically broke them up, right? So I wouldn't be feeling your oats too much at this point. There will be a strong counter reaction if you overplay your hand.
Well, that'll be listeners' homework then, to go back and look at the industrial policy.
That's right. You can just read it. Yeah. I'll write about it so they can see it.
Yeah.
We don't have to go hunt and peck for it.
And then a couple of weeks ago, Alan, what were you writing about? I love the title. Better to be a dog in times of tranquility than a human in times of chaos, right? So,
yeah. It's like a super fun part of writing the newsletter is I actually go back and look at all these quotes, and none of them are accurate, right? So there's supposedly this ancient Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, which...
It won't even Chinese, right?
No. So Joseph Chamberlain's father, so he was the British prime minister who, did the deal with Hitler in Munich, the appeasement. And so his father had used some phrase repeatedly about an ancient Chinese curse, and there was a couple of versions of it. And what they think it's based on is a 16th century short story where there was a Chinese proverb in it said, better to be a dog in times of tranquility than a human in times of chaos. So I love that.
Yeah.
Even better, right? So it kind of got me thinking. I thought about this because I was listening to Tyler Cowen, who's an economist at GMU right near here, talking with Dwarkesh Patel on his podcast, which I highly recommend everybody listen to. Tyler's a genius and thinks faster than I can think. So I have to like slow down the podcast and pause it to think through the
Put it on
implications.
half speed.
I would put it on half speed. Usually I just pause it and go, what's that about?
What does that mean? Yeah.
So he, it started as a sort of caution against overplaying AI, right? So Dwarkesh was very clearly thinking, he wanted Tyler to say, hey, we're going to have 10% growth because of AI. Like, we're going to get all these PhD level AGIs that do all the work that humans did. And all of a sudden, we're going to have this massive growth. Like, I think Balaj, whatever his name is, that guy, Balaji or whatever, he's like talking about crazy numbers of growth. And he's also talking about Bitcoin being at 1 million. So I wouldn't necessarily listen to him too much. So about a year and a half ago. So that didn't happen. But, Tyler points out, like, look, go back and look at base rates of growth. I mean, even during the Industrial Revolution, we went from 0 to probably 1% to 2% growth during the Industrial Revolution. And then if you look at things like electricity, and I mean, electricity is an amazing technology that changed everything, right? It added max 0.5 to 1% of GDP growth a year, right? Look at personal computers, kind of at the low end of that, probably more like 0.3, 0.5. And his point is two things. First of all, I see this with my own company. It is really hard for people to absorb new technologies and use them purposefully, right? So even without any pushback or regulation or anything like that, people just have a hard time incorporating new tools into their business process.
It's incorporating change, right? And change is always difficult for the human species.
Exactly.
Whatever
And
it
I see not resistance, but just like how hard it is to roll out AI. I've been working on it for 2 years and we've made some progress, but not a ton. And I use it a lot. But even I noticed that I don't use it. So I'm like, why didn't I use AI for that? It's like, you don't think about it and it's not. So basically, like, I think it's going to take time where each new product rolls out AI. And at first you get AI on the product and it kind of works, but doesn't really do anything useful. It's like some little button that you push and didn't really help you. Eventually it'll get built into all these products, but it'll take 2, 3, 4 years and it'll get a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. Oh, by the way, that's 0.5% growth. So, and then there are going to be regulatory things where, like, hey, is this thing HIPAA compliant for healthcare? Government's going to regulate, like I would say in the current administration, there's more of a fear-based thing about AI than an embrace, right? So people are more worried about getting in trouble for using it incorrectly than they are about getting any credit for using it well. So, maybe that changes, but it'll take time. And then they're just like other, there's this thing called Baumol's cost disease and things like that where so Baumol was an economist. I think it's Baumol or Baumol. I can't remember.
Okay.
So he said, like, look, as certain industries get really efficient, other industries, they are able to pay their workers more, right? So, like, I can make TVs for nothing. I don't need as many employees. So now I can pay the remaining ones 20, 30, 40% more over time. Well, that raises salaries and costs across, because now the doctors have to make more money, even though they're not getting more efficient, right? And so one of the classic stories is it still takes 4 people to play a string quartet, right? And now you're paying them, way more, magnitudes more than you would have in Beethoven's time. Back then they would have made, whatever currency was in Vienna at the time. And they made 1 and now they make 100,000, right? And so you've got to pay them more, even though they can't produce any more string quartets in any better way than they did 200 years ago. And so that's Baumol's cost disease. There's other, you have a jagged frontier, as Ethan Malik put it, of where innovation happens. Or there's William Gibson, the writer, famously said, the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. So I think that's what you're going to see. And then you've got, explicit regulatory barriers as well. And then in addition to the cost disease, you have an example would be, I can come up with 1 million cures for diseases with AI. but I can't run a million clinical trials to show that they work, right?
Okay.
And so you've got these barriers along the way that become much like sort of like in operations research, you talk about where the bottleneck is. Well, you start moving the bottlenecks, right? So it's like, all right, I took the bottleneck away from finding new cures, but now I've just moved it to clinical trials. So maybe I get 10% more drugs, but I'm not going to get 1,000% more. Now, maybe someday I can fix that clinical trial thing through something, but that's going to take me 5 years to figure that out, get it approved, blah, blah, blah. So his point is that there are all these bottlenecks all over the place, so you're just not going to blow through them all in one day. And his point would be, just look at history. It doesn't happen. So I tend to agree with him. I think it will be, but then the other side of that is people discount how important 1% more of GDP growth is a year, right? You compound that.
It's important.
Right. So you figure growth is real is 2%, 3% max. That's 50 to, 25 to 50% more growth a year if you get 1%, right? So that's a lot. You compound that over a decade or two and you have significantly increase. So again, it's like one of these things where like people are talking about these ridiculous figures of like 10% a year, but then they're kind of like forgetting that 1% a year more would be dramatic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where I kind of go. It's like, yes, you will have dramatic effects. It'll just take a little bit longer than people think it will. But let's not discount the effects.
And so that's the point. No, like people are so afraid of the impact and the change and how, it sounds so cliche to say, but like, we're all going to be dumbed down, stupid. Our kids, what's going to happen to them or our grandkids? So the overarching theme here is like, just chill out. It's not going to be as rapid and as horrible. And hopefully we figure out how to use, these technologies AI for the best.
Right. Yeah. I mean, think about it this way. I mean, if AI suddenly took away 5 million jobs, that would not be good for the economy. There'd be 5 million people who wouldn't be paying bills and buying stuff. Right. So that AI, for those 5 million, for that to become positive growth, some other part of the economy has to figure out, or AI itself has to create more than 5 million new jobs or 5 million new jobs that are more efficiently allocated, right? That's what technologies do. Over time, they eliminate jobs, but they create other ones, and those other ones are usually better, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but that happens gradually over time as the economy adjusts. If all of a sudden you have some technology that gets rid of large swaths of the workforce, that will be a depression. So I doubt that's going to happen, right? I just don't see it. But I also think that the tech bros, right, like we were just talking about, they don't understand basic economics and politics and things like that. They have, God bless, as Tyler says, God bless them. I'm glad that there are people that have this positive vision. I share much of it. But let's be, on the other hand, they have to be tempered by reality a little bit here. And I think the second half of the piece is that they undersell how much change will come just with that 1.5 to 1% compounding. And, I go back and look at historical analogies of like, well, what, sort of the other point I was making there is you've had like some disruption in society because of like the internet, right? And it seemed like it required, like the information revolution has had a lot of effects, right? But it seemed like it required first, like mainframe computers, then personal computers. Then you kind of needed the cloud and mobile, and now and the internet right before that. Those combined to create social media, which is certainly a disruptive force. I mean, that's why we got Trump and all these things, right? Mm-hmm. And now AI on top of it, with intelligence on top of that stack, it feels like this might be, I don't know, it's hard to predict these things, right? But it feels like a very powerful stack that I think eventually will be viewed as one set of continuous innovation. Mm-hmm. And so like I look at that stack together as having the level of disruption in society that say like the printing press did, along with all the things that came along with that, with more, not mass media, but more media back in 1400s, right? And what happened as a result, right? You have Monk in Wittenberg, Germany, Martin Luther publishing his theses on the church door, basically complaining about the church selling indulgences. And let's look 100 years before that, there was a guy in Bohemia named John Huss who was complaining about the church selling indulgences and the corruption of the church. And before that, there was a guy, John Wycliffe in England, who's doing the same thing.
Right. Each one's building on the other.
Right. But they weren't able to get their message out the same way. Right. So Huss ended up getting killed by the church. And 100 years later, with the printing press, Luther was able to build a community. There's also some political dynamics going on, right? Of
course. But it enabled building out a community and getting the word.
And then he was successful, right? Now he lost control of that revolution, and now there's 25,000 kinds of Protestantism, right? My kids ask me the difference between Methodists and Presbyterians, and I'm barely can tell them anything. It's no minute differences, right? Methodists don't drink and they don't kneel. But it's these tiny little differences, right? And so clearly, and then not only did it launch Martin Luther, right, and launched this Reformation, which led to the 30 Years' War, which wiped out, I don't know, somewhere between a fifth and a third of Germany's population over 30 years. I mean, this had devastating effects and eventually led to the Treaty of Westphalia, which is basically the modern foundation of liberalism, which is hey, we can't all agree with each other, right? We can't all agree with each other on what's right, first principles, right? So what we're going to do is construct a system where we're going to have rules about how people interact with each other, and we're just going to stop trying to make everybody believe the first principles that I believe, right? And that created the modern state system in Europe, which we still largely live with, right? And so that was all launched by printing press. So you think about AI on the stack with that 1% growth every year compounding, it's starting to really show in our society. And I think, I interviewed this guy, Paul Hodges, from what's his thing called
I just listened to that.
newnormal.com, new-normal.com. But, he's making the point that sort of the possibility of what could happen is the boundaries are starting to expand. And so, he made a point to me. He's Trump could do no tariffs, or he could do tariffs everywhere at some high rate.
Idea.
No one has any idea what's going to happen. Right? And it's we're seeing a Middle East that was locked in this kind of terrible conflict between Sunni Shia with also Israel kind of in there, been completely reformed in a year, right? Turkey's ascendant, Israel's ascendant, Iran's on the back foot, So it's just it feels like this is another big time of change, around, we kind of had that with the Cold War ending. Now Trump's talking about the U.S. being an expansionist, imperialist power, taking down Denmark. And God, evil Denmark.
They've been a big threat.
Right. And then we've got,
we're going to get Greenland.
Yeah. And we got Taiwan going, China retaking Taiwan. We had, the other thing is we had 40 years with declining interest rates. And then we went from 1% inflation to 9% in 6 months. It's just the level of volatility and the error bounds are getting larger. Yeah. And so that to me, right. And I think it's going to accelerate.
Error whiplash.
Yeah. And I think it's going to accelerate with this tech stack. And I think a lot of this is really based off of the technology, right, that allows these things to happen. And we're just at the beginning of it. So I think we're at the Martin Luther posted the theses on the door, 10 years ago, and we're about to go into the chaos as a result. So
I love how you just gave a history of Western world over the last 1,000 years in 1 minute and 4 seconds.
Thank you. I like that. I think maybe some historians would poke some holes in there somewhere.
Great.
Yeah. So it does help to be raised by someone who was about to be a history professor, but pulled back at the last minute.
Yeah.
And I think that this is just, again, going back, I always look at the history of these things, right? And you look at radio and film is what drove Hitler and Mussolini to power, right? It was that ability to organize mass groups, right? And, you think about TV being why Kennedy won versus Nixon, or, there's all these kind of things. I don't think that was quite as epical as what we're seeing now. But these technologies bring massive change, even if it's over time, it compounds, right? But it compounds in a massive change. And it's, like as I say in the piece, you might dread that, right? But
I think that's what I hear living where I live. It's a different tone. It's more, it's a more I don't want to use that's a little bit, over the top apocalyptic, but the fear, it feels more, fear.
And I think it's justified.
Yeah.
I think it goes, look, I'm kind of, as I'm talking through this, I'm realizing my themes, right? Like the thing we talked about before is just that it's inevitable. And to me, this is inevitable. Like these are, I guess I'm becoming Tolstoyan in my old age, that there are these like world historical forces that shape people versus the other way. But, there's no way that we're going to, would you rather not have a printing press? Would you rather not have the modern state system? Would you rather not have the Industrial Revolution? Would you rather not have commercial agriculture? Would you rather not have, everything comes with good
folks argue that the stakes are so much higher with AI, for example, but the counter argument would be that's not how it felt, to those in the 1400s, right? It felt the same.
Or someone watching the nuclear cloud over Hiroshima.
Right. It's all relative, right? And who knows?
Yeah, like I said, clean nuclear power comes with nuclear weapons, AI-driven healthcare cures come with AI drone swarms that kill people, right? So like these, technology is a morally neutral concept, and it creates, I think in the end, it creates change that is great for all the future generations. But we go through these wrenching periods. And I think we're in the middle of one. And it's so
transition, right?
And it'll be, I worry about some of the things coming. It's going to be a tough.
What do you worry about most?
I think probably nothing that, nothing novel that other people don't worry about. So I would think probably something I probably need to think more about. But obviously you worry about war over Taiwan. You worry about if we lost that war, would that mean the end of U.S. hegemony? I worry about a general trend across the world toward aging and no one having babies. And I look at places like Europe and I think, what's going to happen there, right? Like these societies cannot afford the welfare states they've created. And people are in complete denial about that. Like like I was saying, like the only majority you can get in the French parliament is to turn back Macron's
retirement age.
Right. And
was it to 60? Yeah.
Yeah, to 60. And it's just like, what are you talking about? Like people have to work longer now. Like, well, you can't afford this stuff. You also can't
work longer. It just really wants to work longer and more, but it's
when you live longer, right? So you can't work less and live longer and have it work out math wise, right?
Right.
And these societies don't accept immigrants well, integrate them well. I think the U.S. is way ahead on that, even though we have our issues. It works out over time.
Despite the headlines of executive orders today, right?
That's right. I go back to, immigration was popular in 2018, 2 years into the immigration crackdown of the first term. I think we're going right back to that. So, there are waves in the United States. We go back and forth, but the people integrate much more successfully into the society here. And that's for a lot of reasons. I don't blame you for it. It's just what they are. And you have very, long histories of societies. Some of them are racially based. It's like the way the U.S. is, right? So I really worry about these societies. Like what happens? Like how dark does it get at some point? So I think and I think that, we look, and I'll probably do something on demographics. I've been reading a few kind of leading scholars who are really looking into what's happening and why. And it doesn't feel like it's reversible. Now, I think that there's probably a natural reversal that will eventually happen. I tend to think that policy is not going to do much here. Like we're not going to be able to bribe people into having more kids or something. Like, I think our like overt interventions will fail, as they've seemed to have in every country so far. But there'll be some natural corrective force. And I'm kind of reading now a little bit about what that might be. There's a guy, Lyman Stone, is writing a lot about it, and a couple of loose scholars I've been reading. So trying to get a sense of like what happens.
What would that, just a little...
Well, there's a bunch of theories. So I'm hesitant to say which ones I think make any sense, but like it might just get... Yeah, it might get to the point where societies basically have to shift the way they think. And once you hit like a crisis, a demographic crisis, there'll become a lot of, natural like support for having more kids. It could be that all the people that don't want to have kids are out of the gene pool. So the people that are left are pronatal people. I don't know. Who knows?
Wow, that sounds almost sci-fi, Alan.
Well, I mean, if you have a tendency, if there's something genetic in the tendency to not breed, then if you don't breed, then you don't pass your genes on, right? So who knows? Maybe that's a little bullshit.
Handmaid's Tale.
A little bit, right? So I don't know. I mean, that might be a little more like woo-woo kind of stuff, but I want to read more about it.
Yeah.
I think we're looking at a real problem that we haven't seen before. And the other piece of it is like, it's not exactly like, you think about like, all right, there was like the Black Death, right? And the plague in Europe. And sometimes up to 75% of some areas were wiped out. And it was at least a third to, or you look at like the 30 Years' War we're just talking about. You've had incidents of major population collapse like that. But then they feel like they recover, right? We're in a different situation now. So I don't think there's a lot of historical analogies of like a slow decline that's by choice, right? That seems different to me. And that's why I'm like, I don't...
Well, it is different.
Right. I can't go back to some historical analogy and be like, oh, it's going to be like this or that, the way I did in these last two pieces. So that's why I'm spending more time and like actually looking at some of these crazier theories, because it's like, I don't know, who knows, right?
Interesting.
But it's pretty clear a lot of the common things like, oh, it's, like people living in apartment buildings too close to each other, too much density. That isn't true. Like Lyman Stone kind of takes that argument apart. The only thing I think he's seen so far that really correlates is child mortality. Like, so basically the fact that kids don't die in childbirth and soon after from diseases has made the tendency, people used to kind of overshoot the number of kids knowing that they want it, knowing that...
Right. They're probably few of them were going to die.
Right. And now they're pretty assured that's not going to happen. So they're kind of undershooting.
Yeah.
And so one of the theories would be like, as our technology to have kids later in life gets better, or I love that geriatric pregnancy term, right? Well, it feels so great.
Yeah. Yeah. 35. Like, yeah.
Oh, yeah. We had one over 35. So I remember that. It's like, oh, God, that's kind of a slap in the face.
No, I was geriatric.
Yeah. So like, as that technology gets better, does that allow people, like maybe if they miss the mark and they wanted more kids, now they can do it in their 40s, blah, blah, blah. Does that change it? I don't know. That doesn't feel like the technology is definitely better, but it doesn't feel like it's changing birth rates. So,
right. Well, and it also doesn't change the fact that, our lifespans have extended, right? They probably will continue to do so. But having kids when you're like 50, half the time I can like barely get out of bed. Because my bones ache. Can you imagine running after? But
what if the AI nanobots fix all your bone aching, right? Then you can do it when you're 50.
Yeah, maybe if the bots, the nanobots can like make my coffee, bring it to me in bed,
That's right. You can you get like the Jetsons maid raising your kids, right? So
yeah.
I don't know. It's also possible that the actual equilibrium of how many people we want around is lower than we think. And maybe we'll hit some equilibrium and then people will be like, oh yeah, now I want to have kids again. I don't know. Or people will realize like another thing that could happen is like, I just thought of this, is like as, basically these welfare and social support systems are going to collapse, right? And I've seen this actually, I want to write about this too. where like if you go read, I love reading the comments section of the Wall Street Journal because it's all these old people who I'm sorry to the Wall Street Journal, but I'm sure your demographic skews old, upper middle class and white, right? And you look at these people, they write an article about cutting government waste or something like that. And they're all like, yeah, get rid of that waste. And it's like, dude, that's not going to balance the budget. What's going to balance the budget is raising taxes on you and cutting your benefits for your pensions and healthcare in your old age. They don't want to hear that. They hear something like that and they're like, you're saying there's not government waste? It's like, no, there's government waste, but it's not balancing the budget. It's your stuff that's balance. They don't want to hear that. They just keep finding another person to blame, right? Go listen to the call-in shows on C-SPAN, right? It's all these old people calling in about how everybody else is the problem, not them.
Do you listen to the call-in shows on C-SPAN?
No, but I've heard clips from other people who've been on. So it's actually interesting every once in a while because it's really boring, and then you get some crazy person comes on, and it's entertaining. So I wish I could just see the clips.
Yeah, they should do like a best of C-SPAN call.
Craziest comments. Yeah. But you just this general tendency of people to deny that everything they want their shit, right? And then if anyone comes and tries to take that, they want to pin it on someone else. It's natural, right? And it could be that we keep denying that until the systems collapse, right? And I think it's going to happen in Europe and Asia first. And at that point, people might start having kids to like support them in their old age. I mean, it might be like, hey, if I don't have kids, this welfare system doesn't work anymore. There's not enough people paying into it. I got to have my own kids, right? So that could be what reverses it. And actually, that's my favorite theory right now.
What about those who are just like, we have too many people on the planet already?
They're assholes. Like, I'm so pro-human and these anti-growth people. The planet can take way more people. People are good. We do good things. I'm firmly just against those people. I think they're crappy.
And I don't think it's a large. I don't think most.
No, I think there are a lot of you talk to half the millennials, they kind of say stuff like that. I'm like, shut up. Like, people scraped and survived for thousands, hundreds of thousands of years so you could get here. And then you're like, too many people on the planet. Like, I have no.
Yeah, is that an economic argument or a moral argument because of the planet, the resources?
Well, is there a difference between those two concepts, economics and morality? So I tend to say no. Yeah. So anyway, that's some of the stuff I'm thinking about is like demographics. How does that story play out? And yeah, it'll probably be a future article.
Yeah. I like it.
I think we're good for today. We've yacked enough. So.
We know. Well,
cool. All right.
Good to talk to you, Alan.
Yeah. Good to talk to you.
You've been listening to The New Rules with Alan Pentz. For more insights on mastering the new game, follow @Pentz, that's APENTZ, on X, and make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, in today's world, you don't follow the rules, you write them.